Okay, so basically there are two types. The previous example that we have looked into is an example of linear SVM. Linear SVM is used for linearly separable data, which means if a data set can be classified into two classes by using a straight line, then such data is termed as linearly separable data. As we have seen in the previous example, it was actually separable by just a straight line, so that was known as a linear SVM. Okay, and the classifier is known as linear SVM classifier. Okay, that's the jargon. The next example is non-linear SVM. Non-linear SVM is used for non-linearly separable data, again, which means if a data set cannot be classified by a straight line, then such data is termed as non-linear data, and the classifier is used as non-linear SVM. So let me give you an example. Okay, so we have this data set. If you see in the 2D plane, this is just for the ease. If the data is in this 2D plane, if you look it out, so if you try to separate the data using a straight line, okay, let's say if you try to do something like this, so obviously you cannot separate your data. Whatever lines you get, okay, whatever lines you create, it will not separate your data. Okay, in these kind of scenario, this is known as non-linear data. Okay, non-linearly separable data, as this cannot be separated from a straight line, as we have a different class inside of it. One class we have inside of this, and the other class, all the data points are outside of this class, right? So in these scenario, what we do is we have the ideology of kernel SVM. We won't go much deeper into that, but just to give a brief idea about that, how it works is we get this data into the 3D plane. If you look into this data in 3D plane, okay, the same data in the 3D plane, you see that it is actually separable by having an hyperplane between. This is known as hyperplane. The straight line where we are seeing out in the 2D, that is in the linear data, that is known as hyperplane. Obviously when we are talking about in the 3D space, so this hyperplane, having a hyperplane between, using kernel SVM, we can actually separate out non-linearly separable data. Okay, so that's about everything about SVM. We have looked into linear SVM and we have looked into non-linear SVM. Okay, now let's jump into the lab section and actually execute our first ever SVM model. Let's jump into our lab sections.